There is one more additional step that should be done to the car before you leave the garage. But there aren't too many people that have the opportunity to do this because they don't have the equipment. And it's called checking the wheel weights. This is a Waco weight checker here that we'll be showing you during this demonstration. And what it does is it has a gauge on it and a lever system. So as you lift up the wheel, the gauge shows you how much weight it takes to actually lift the wheel up. And what we want to do is we want to get the weights equal side to side or on the diagonal, which we'll show you on the blackboard in a few moments. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this wrong, but there's only about one way to do it right. And the one thing you want to be careful to remember is you have to do it on a level surface, and you have to make sure that the tires are all aired and that you have the sway bar links removed. In other words, you only have to take off one link, just like we did when we aligned the car. But you have to have the sway bar off because it would interfere with the readings of the springs. What you're trying to do is balance the weight on the corners, so you don't have more weight on the right front wheel when you turn left than you do on the left front wheel when you turn right. Now, we usually want to use a shim underneath the tire, which I have an aluminum shim here, which I'll just pull out to show you. All it is a piece of 040, and we stick it under the tire using the checker. And when you put the checker up against the tire, you want to make sure you're not on the valve stem and you're not on any bolts or any rivets or anything, depending on upon what kind of wheel you have. And you want to make sure that the level, the beam is as close to level as possible. Now, these tires are pretty small, and there's some of these beams that you might have to cut off to get this thing a little closer to level. But when you go to the rear wheel and the rim is going to be a little bit higher, you want to make sure that you put a block under this to keep it about the same level as it was on the front. And slowly lift up the lever until you can just barely pull the sheet of aluminum out. And as you start pulling it out, whatever the gauge says at that point, that's what you read. In this case, it's about 125 pounds. We pull the shim out. And the next step is to go to the next wheel. And then after that, we go to the two rear wheels. And once you get on the blackboard, I'll show you what to do with this. But if the weight is off, we go to the spring perches and we have to adjust it. And this is called sometimes jacking weight. The oval track drivers do this on purpose, is they want, like the left front wheel, to weigh more than the right front wheel because they're always turning one direction. But on a road course, all this leads to is instability under braking and a different handling characteristic from one direction to the other. So we have to make sure that the weights are about the same. And there's two ways to check this. But before we get into that, just a reminder about the gauges. Especially this type of gauge, which is a Waco weight checker, the oil in it is very thick, and it takes a little time to warm it up. So you might want to sit here and just pump the gauge a little bit to get the oil going on a cold morning, because otherwise the reading isn't going to be as high as it should be, and you'll start on one tire, and by the time you get to the last one, it's going to be reading where it should be, and your weights are going to be off. You'll start jacking the weight, and then you'll check it again, and it'll be wrong. And so you want to make sure you get the gauge right and make sure you get consistent readings. The one thing I like to do is if I start on the right front wheel and I go to the left front and the left rear and the right rear, then I go all the way back in the opposite direction and check it twice just to make sure the readings are correct. And that way you know the gauge is warmed up and then everything works out correctly. Let's go to the blackboard and try to explain how to readjust this if it is off. Okay, using the visual aids, once again, we've made a grid on the blackboard here to represent the four corners of the car. And this is the way you might want to write it down on your sheet when you're trying to figure this out, is that as we take the car off, you can see that this corner represents the right front corner, the left front, and the left rear, and the right rear. And what we want to do is write down the weights that we found when we use the weight checker on the car and see what they add up to. Let's say this one is 140 pounds. And this one is 160 pounds. And this one is 210. And about, let's say, 230. Okay, now there's two ways you can do this. The one way is to just add the sides or just put the sides together and say, okay, this one weighs 20 pounds less than the left front. And you can try to jack weight into this wheel. And the way you would do that is by trying to screw up the spring perch like you were raising the car on this corner and then rechecking the weight until you got the weight as close as possible. The only problem with doing it this way is that you're also going to affect the weight on the left rear corner, because the weight always changes diagonally in a race car when you jack it around like this. And let's say you're racing on an oval and you wanted to get more weight on this wheel, then you would jack up this one and it would transfer the weight to the left front. So the easiest way to do it, and the way that I do it, is you add the diagonals together. These two and these two. And you add their sums at the bottom. And so you have to realize that these two are about 50 pounds lighter than these two. And so we have to say, okay, we have to jack up these two corners. So you would screw up this one 2 turns, and maybe this one 2 turns. Now most likely on most formula cars, rear engine cars, you're going to get a lot more difference if you screw the front ones around than you do on the rear, because there's more weight on the rear and it's harder to move it around. And you can get a lot more reaction if you just do the fronts. But what you want to end up with is hopefully these two here will add up to a certain amount, and these two will add up to a certain amount, and those sums will be the same. And once you have that, you can put the sway bars back on the car, checking the preload to make sure that it hasn't changed, and you're ready to run the car. We have the opportunity to have a close look at an RT1 Formula Atlantic Ralt, which is a very common and well-known chassis in this class, especially in the amateur ranks. It's basically set up the same way as the Crosley as far as all the suspension pickup points are concerned. The only difference is that on the top A-arm to adjust the caster, we have the bushing setup that we mentioned before, where you would have shims on either end of the A-arm, and you would move the shims forward or back to move the A-arm around to move the pivot point back. We have the camber barrel system, which is exactly the same as the Crosley was as far as the 35s on up in the Crosley numbering system. And the nice thing is on this car is we have a parallel plate system on the steering for the bump steer, so instead of having the washers and a bolt holding the steering rod on one end, it is double sheared in a way that we have almost 1.5 inches of adjustment for the bump steer. So as you can change the geometry even on this car and still be able to adjust the bump. Now, the only thing different about this car basically is that everything's bigger, and since the car is, of course, a little bit faster, the danger factor goes up. So we have to make sure that as we're checking all this stuff that we did before, we're extra careful about, worn out rod ends and cracked joints and pickup points that are a little bit worn out, and elongated holes, especially in the aluminum monocoque. We want to make sure that we check for these things a little more carefully than we did before. The RT1 also gives us the opportunity to show you a different means for aligning the car as far as the strings are concerned. On this car, we've made what we call an alignment beam system. We've been using it for quite a few years on it. And all it is some angle aluminum put together in a way that you bolt it onto an existing part of the car. In other words, a reference that doesn't get banged around too much, hopefully. And you can do this in the pits, you can do it in the garage, you can do it anywhere you want to do it. It doesn't really have to be level either, just as long as the beams always end up in the same place after you attach them to the car. And you find the center line of the car and put it on the beam. You measure to the end of the beam, and you can tie your strings in a hole that you drill in the end of it and stretch it to the beam on the other end of the car. The nice thing about this is you don't have to measure any strings when you set them up. You put the beam on the car, and you tie the strings in, and you tie the strings to each beam so they stretch across the sides of the car, and the strings are set. There isn't any more hassle. And the other nice thing is that you don't really have to have any jack stands, and you don't have to have a level surface, because the strings, providing the piece of the car you attach them to is still not damaged, the strings are still the right height with the wheels, so you can align the car correctly.